Listen to this, friends. I have seen more of death, discouragement, deprivation, and injustice. I have stood beside more hospital beds, buried more children, listened to more confessions, witnessed the shipwreck of more marriages and relationships, felt more of the hopelessness that comes with great loss and the pain of broken hearts than I can now remember or even care to remember. That's written by my guest, Dr. Philip Carlson, who is a medical doctor as well as a pastor. Welcome. All the way from the Sierra Madre. That sounds very desert-like.
Oh, it's a beautiful place. Lots of trees.
Lots of trees.
Lots of
beautiful
trees.
weather.
Yeah.
California. Is that Southern California?
Southern California, near Pasadena.
Near Pasadena. Well, you practice medicine in Pasadena, right?
I do.
And you pastor in Sierra Madre?
In Sierra Madre, which is right on the border of Pasadena.
First question, I know what pastoring is like. How does one pastor and doctor at the same time?
Well, first of all, I'm a full-time pastor and a part-time doctor,
Right.
and most of the time it works pretty well. Sometimes it's crazy, and the busiest part of our lives are the 4 remarkable kids God has given my wife and I. And it's a full life, definitely.
Well, no kidding. When I was reading your book, Love Written in Stone, and that's quite the title, and I'll ask you about that in a minute. But when I'm reading your book, and I'm thinking, not only how does this guy juggle all of this, but 4 kids, and is it 2 of them who are adopted?
One.
One who's Chera, is that how you pronounce it?
Kira, yeah.
Kira.
Yeah. 5-year-old now.
5-year-old who has cerebral palsy?
Right.
How's she doing?
She's doing great. She's come along. When she was born, the doctors told us she probably wouldn't live. When she lived, they told us she would never walk. At 2, she walked. They told us she wouldn't talk. She's talking. She's coming along. She has her challenges. She's been in and out of the hospital a lot, but she's the love of our life. She's brought out the best in our children. She is a gift from God in every way. We just are crazy about her.
Now, you had a reason not to adopt, in that the first time you tried, it went south, and it was really quite tragic. Tell us about that.
Well, we adopted a young fellow at birth. Aaron is still his name. His mother kept that name, and he was in our home for 3.5 months. And then she decided to take him back, and that loss was probably one of the 2 most painful losses in my life. We just are crazy about that little guy, and we actually had him back in our home a second time and lost him a second time. And so the grief and the pain and the anguish were just multiplied over and over.
It's kind of like a living death in some ways.
It is, yeah.
But you decided, we'll try again, and
we'll try again.
And Kira came along.
Yeah.
What was the other major loss in your life?
Well, I had a foster child at the time we were married, named Tamar, and he had leukemia.
Right.
And when we went through 4 recurrences and remissions, and the final recurrence, and then he died when he was 13 years old, and about a year after we were married. And he was every bit a son to me. I love him with all of my heart, think of him every single day. And that's the other loss that I just count. So Carol and I see ourselves as having 6 children. 2 of them aren't with us in different ways right now, but we will see them again.
Yeah. You'll probably follow these kids for as long as you live, right? In one way or another.
Yeah.
Tell me about your relationship with your dad. You know, in the book Love Written in Stone, you bring it up several times.
Yeah.
Not a good relationship.
No, my dad, I didn't really understand this till my adult life, but my dad had a very secret problem with alcohol, and when he drank, he was very violent, and so I was often beaten up pretty badly, to the point of a couple times broken bones, broken teeth, and by the time I left home at 18, I really had no relationship with my father whatsoever. But during seminary, especially at Fuller Seminary, there was a period of tremendous healing in my life, and I went to counseling for the first time, and it was kind of, the process of peeling the onion for 8 years every week with this godly Christian man named David Gatewood, and I really attribute him with, in many ways, mediating God's grace in a life-saving way through that ministry of counseling, and worked through a lot of stuff.
Now, when you're suffering at the hands of your father,
Yeah.
who is supposed to be the anchor in your life,
Yeah.
who's supposed to be the moral compass in your life,
Yeah.
the comfort, the protector. Often a kid who undergoes that kind of abuse ends up becoming a statistic.
Right.
How is it that you chose such a creative path?
Well, it's funny when I think I made the mistake that a lot of young people make, this kind of sense of youthful invincibility that somehow I was going to be different than everybody else and emerge unscathed. And when I came to Fuller Seminary, it was the first like perfectly safe environment in my life. And it was odd to me that in that environment, I really figured out how totally messed up I was. There were just so many things in my life that were out of whack, and I realized I needed help. And I pondered this until a few years ago. I finally figured it out. Why at Fuller Seminary, when I finally felt safe, did I realize what a mess I was? And that's because that's what grace does. You know, with grace, we have nothing to prove. We don't have to hide. We don't have to live by our shame or let our shame dictate the program. We're free to be ourselves. We're free to be honest and transparent. And that's what happened to me. And that led me into counseling and into rebuilding of my life piece by piece. And that happened subsequently with my siblings. And finally, in my late 20s, just before I got married, in my relationship with my father. In fact, I came to Toronto from Seattle, where I spent a few days visiting my dad, and we have a great relationship. And by God's grace, God has changed him and he has changed me, and we are at a very different place. And my wife and children cannot recognize in my father at all the kinds of things I grew up with because of the power of God's grace in his life. He is a different man, and
wow.
I love him and respect him and have a good relationship with him.
Why did you choose a ministry?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was, when I was young, I started going to this church called Bethany Church. It's a long story. When I was 9 years old, I went up into the office of the pastor and prayed and gave my life to Christ. When I was 13 years old, a tall, wonderful Norwegian woman named Alice Patterson put her hands on my shoulder, looked me in the eyes, and she said, "Phil, God's hand is on your life for ministry." And nobody had ever said anything like that to me before, but I recognized immediately the truth of it. I really felt that that's what God was calling me to do. And so I pursued that passionately. I kind of felt torn because I wanted to study medicine also, but early on, given the choice, I knew that if I had to do one or the other, I would pursue ministry.
But so you pursued ministry, but decided that maybe you should do some medicine too. And you say in your book that you were concerned about preachers being paid poorly.
Yeah, well, I grew up in a poor family, really, by every measure, very poor family. And I thought, well, if I have to choose, maybe I should choose the one where I'd make a better living. But in the end, it was the call of God to ministry that won. And so I was a senior pastor of a church for 8 years in Pasadena. And during that time, Tamar died, and the woman in the church who was probably the most gifted lay leader I've ever worked with, named Maida Hall, she died of breast cancer. And through those experiences, walking through those illnesses with them, I just felt this resurgence of my desire to study medicine. So I applied to USC because my wife didn't want to move out of the area. And I was a third person accepted in my medical school class, went through USC, and then I chose Glendale Adventist as the place to do my family practice residency because it was geographically closest to our house. And it was a wonderful time. In fact, it's ironic that my wife thinks of those as tremendously wonderful years.
Now, were you involved in church life at the same time when you were doing your medical studies?
Yeah, there was an overlap because we went back to Bethany Church, the church where I accepted Christ, and met my wife when we were teenagers. And it's actually the church that I now pastor. It's kind of ironic that the office where I accepted Christ as a 9-year-old for years has been the office where I work every day. And we have just loved our relationship with that church, so we went back there, and I ended up being called to be the pastor. So during my residency, I was actually the senior pastor of the church.
Now, residency, that's when they try to kill young doctors.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, you must have been spending 24 hours sometimes without sleep.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you survived.
We survived, yeah. We got through it.
Tell me about the book, Love Written in Stone. Why did you choose that title?
Well, I had this concept that really came in discussion with an editor at Bethany House, a wonderful guy named Andy McGuire, and we were talking about the fact that there's a growing body of evidence coming to us from modern science showing that the things that God asks of us actually produce tremendous outcomes in human experience. And in light of one of the great challenges in our culture is this, our distorted image of God and viewing God as being not good and having impossible expectations. And in the recent wave of anti-God literature that is so popular and sells so well, is the best evidence of that. And so I thought, well, what would happen if we wrote a book where we actually talked about what we know scientifically about the impact of God's Word on human lives? And so I looked at the 4 major relationships broken by sin and did some research and thinking about each of those areas and carefully documented the findings of modern science in each of these areas on some key topics, and this book emerged. And it's just an attempt to have a civil dialogue with people who might think otherwise about how good God is and how His goodness is revealed in what He asks of us, and then to encourage Christians to know that what God asks of them is completely good and in their best interest.
Yeah, you divide the book into 4 parts. Part 1, guidance for our relationship with God. Part 2, instructions for our relationship with others. Part 3, directions for a healthier self. And Part 4, insight for our relationship with creation. Let's talk a little bit about Part 3, directions for a healthier self. You talk about self-care, health and wellness. And you know, when I was reading that part, I underlined something here, if I can just find it. Yeah. Where you mention your daughter, Kira, with cerebral palsy and a seizure disorder, and you say likely the result of poor medical management at birth. This doesn't directly relate to what you're writing, but when does the actual cerebral palsy happen? Is it oxygen deprivation in the birthing process, or what creates it?
Well, in many cases, like Kira's case, you can't know to an absolute certainty, but it can happen prenatally while the child's still in the womb, or it can happen during the birth process, perinatally, and sometimes postnatally, like if there's some oxygen deprivation, but somewhere along the way there's an assault on the brain that causes these physical manifestations known as cerebral palsy.